Okay, so wow, this deep dive is going to be interesting. You sent us a pretty intense collection of documents all about this group, the International Institute of Knowledge of Identity, or IWOT. They also go by the Czaitania mission. Have you heard of them?
Yeah, I've come across them in my research.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of controversy surrounding them, accusations of being like a cult, manipulation, financial exploitation,
Right.
the whole nine yards. So we're going to really dig into all this, see what we can uncover. Basically, we're going to try to help you guys out there figure out what to make of all of this.
Yeah, I think that's really important with a group like this.
Absolutely. So to start, just to give everyone a lay of the land, we've got excerpts from like an analysis of the leader's teachings, a transcript from a lecture, a document outlining their like unwritten rules, and even some like analyses about how they treat neurotypical members.
Yeah, those analyses are particularly interesting, I think.
Totally. And actually, this is really heavy, but there's a document about the suicide of a former member, which is
Hmm?
really raises some questions about like their responsibility towards their members.
Absolutely, yeah. The ethical implications are huge.
Huge, yeah. Okay, so before we get into all that, can you just give us a quick overview of this Chaitanya mission? Like, how big are they? Are they like a well-known group?
So they actually started in the United States back in the 70s and then kind of spread to different countries. They're not exactly a household name, but they do have a following. They claim to be part of like this branch of Hinduism called Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And the leader, Chris Butler, who also goes by Siddheswarup, he emphasizes chanting, service, simple living, all as like paths to enlightenment.
Yeah. So on the surface, they sound like a pretty standard spiritual group.
Right, very much so.
But these documents, they suggest something a little darker.
Right, yeah, a much more complex picture.
Definitely. So one thing
Yeah.
that really jumped out at me was this idea of bombardment love, which sounds kind of intense.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one.
Is this a real like psychological thing? How is it different from just being, welcoming and supportive?
Well, it is a recognized technique, and it's all about like overwhelming new recruits with affection and attention. So they feel this really intense sense of belonging like really quickly. But the document suggests this love has conditions.
Ah, yeah, there's always a catch.
Right. And it looks like Butler really stresses the idea that people are inherently sinful. Like they need him to guide them, to offer redemption.
So they feel unworthy, but then also completely dependent on him.
Yeah, exactly. It's a powerful combination.
That's pretty messed up. Do they give any specific examples of how he used this to like actually manipulate people?
Oh, yeah, there are a few. For example, his teachings about Maya, that whole concept of the material world being an illusion.
Right, yeah.
But he frames it in a way that makes people fear it, feel trapped by it. And the only way out, according to him, is total surrender to his teachings. It's like he's the only lifeline.
That's intense.
Yeah.
So, speaking of manipulation, let's talk about NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. It's mentioned a lot, but a lot of people might not know what it is.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
It is. So can you break it down for us? Like, how is it a tool for manipulation?
Okay, so NLP is basically about how language affects our thoughts and feelings and actions. And it can be used in good ways, like in therapy and stuff, but if you use it to, like, coerce people,
Yeah, then it gets scary.
it can get really scary. And the document suggests Butler used specific language patterns to make people afraid and obedient. He would, like, imply there were dangers if you didn't follow his teachings.
But like vague dangers, so you never really know what you're supposed to be afraid of.
Exactly. And that creates this constant anxiety, so people are more likely to just, like, go along with whatever he says.
Oh, that's so creepy. So did anyone ever like push back against this? Was there any resistance?
There is this one part in the lecture transcript that's really chilling. It's from a guy named Tapasya Das, a leader in the Polish branch.
Okay, yeah.
He talks about how some leaders were trying to copy Butler's methods, and he actually uses the phrase psychological terror to describe what they created. Like, people were afraid to speak up or ask questions.
So even some of his own people were like, whoa, this is too much.
It seems that way, yeah. He even admits that it was toxic.
Wow. So they knew what they were doing. Do they give more details about what this psychological terror actually looked like?
There are mentions of public shaming, forced confessions, and even like isolating people from the community if they questioned anything. And it's all framed as like spiritual purity.
So it's even harder to see it for what it really is.
Exactly. Abuse disguised as spiritual guidance.
Ugh, yeah. And it wasn't just their emotions they were manipulating. Let's get into the financial side of things, these unwritten rules we keep hearing about.
Right, let's talk about that.
What were they all about?
So the documents outline these rules that basically kept people dependent on the group, financially and emotionally. One rule was that you couldn't have a business that competed with Butler's businesses.
What? So, like, you had to tell them what your job was and everything?
Yeah, they had to disclose everything. And if they saw your work as competition, you either had to stop or give Butler a cut of your income, like a big cut.
It's not enough to just dedicate your life. You have to dedicate your livelihood, too.
Yeah, it really is all-encompassing.
Okay, that's starting to sound a lot like a cult.
What else?
Oh, and there was also a rule against criticizing Butler or the leadership.
Yeah.
Any criticism, and you could be ostracized, like shunned by the entire community.
Even your own family.
Yeah, even your family. Imagine dedicating your life to something and then losing everything just because you question it.
That's messed up. So how did their teachings line up with actual Gaudiya Vaishnavism?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The documents suggest they deviated quite a bit from tradition. Like, Gaudiya Vaishnavism is known for chanting a wide variety of mantras, and like it had this rich musical tradition. But the Czaitania mission limited the chanting to just a few mantras. And get this, they even used Western melodies instead of traditional ones. So they're not even sticking to the tradition. They're making up their own thing.
Yeah, it's almost like they took bits and pieces of Gaudiya Vaishnavism just to make themselves seem legitimate.
Right, to make it look authentic.
Exactly. But really, they built this whole new belief system around Butler. And by keeping people away from the real tradition, they made sure everyone stayed dependent on his interpretations.
And they even restricted studying traditional scriptures, right?
Yep. The focus was always on Butler's teachings, like they were creating this little bubble where he controlled everything.
Wow, that's crazy. And what about contact with the outside world?
Oh, yeah, they had rules about that too. They limited contact with anyone outside the group, even family and friends who weren't members. And forget about using the internet, unless it was for approved propaganda.
So they were totally isolated.
Very much so. And a lot of ex-members said they had no idea how controlling it would be until they were already in deep.
So it was like a bait and switch.
Yeah.
They lure you in with all the love and acceptance, then bam, you're trapped.
That's exactly it. Classic cult tactic.
This is all pretty disturbing stuff.
It really is.
And we still haven't even gotten to their views on education and their treatment of neurotypical members.
Right. There's still a lot to unpack.
Yeah. I think we need to take a break here and let everyone absorb all of this. This is heavy stuff.
Yeah, good idea. We'll be back soon to continue this deep dive. You know, it's kind of funny. Like, they call themselves the Institute of Knowledge.
Right.
But they weren't really into, like, actual learning.
That is weird. I mean, you'd think knowledge and identity, like, they'd go hand in hand, wouldn't you?
You'd think so, yeah. But these documents say they discouraged followers from getting higher education, especially in anything related to religion or psychology, stuff like that.
Really? That's so strange. It's like they were afraid people would start thinking for themselves.
Yeah, it does seem that way.
What did they say about educate? Like, what was their reasoning?
Well, they'd quote Butler's teachings about worldly knowledge being a distraction from spiritual growth, that kind of thing. They even said that being curious was a sign of ego.
So instead of encouraging people to learn and grow, they basically made it a bad thing.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's so messed up. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about initiation. Most spiritual traditions have some sort of formal process for, like, showing your commitment, right?
Right, like a ritual or a ceremony.
Exactly. So did the Czaitania mission have anything like that?
They did, but the documents say it was pretty different from traditional Gaudiya Vaishnava practices. It seemed like Chris Butler had total control over the whole thing.
What do you mean by total control? Like, what did that look like?
Well, even for the first level of initiation, which is called Harinama initiation, you had to send a written request directly to Butler himself.
Harinama initiation. Remind me what that is again.
Oh, it's basically the first step in becoming an official disciple in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. You get a mantra for chanting from your teacher.
Right, okay.
But in the Czaitania mission, you needed Butler's permission for even that.
So, like, even for a small commitment, he had to be involved.
Yeah, it seems that way. It's like they wanted to make sure everyone knew he was in charge.
That's a little much, don't you think?
Definitely. And get this, the documents say that submitting a request was seen as a binding commitment to Butler as your guru, even if he never actually granted you initiation.
Wait, so just asking to be initiated meant you were a disciple, even if he said no?
That's what it sounds like.
That's so weird. What if someone changed their mind after submitting a request?
The documents don't really say, but there are stories of people being pressured and guilt-tripped if they even thought about backing out.
Wow. Like, once they had you in their sights, they wouldn't let go.
Yeah, pretty much.
So was there at least some kind of formal process for deciding who got initiated?
There was a process, but it was super secretive. Apparently, there was this inner circle of leaders who would evaluate people based on their loyalty, how much they were willing to serve the mission, and how much money they give.
Hold on. Money was a factor.
Yeah, it seems that way. There are reports of Butler demanding huge sums of money from people who wanted to be initiated.
Seriously. So you basically had to pay to be a disciple.
That's what it sounds like.
That's crazy. Did anyone complain about that?
They did have justifications, of course. The documents say they called these contributions offerings or sacrifices to show your devotion and purify your karma.
Oh, right, because giving money totally cleanses your soul.
Exactly.
It's all just a way to manipulate people. What about people who wanted to leave the group? What happened to them?
Leaving was really hard, and usually it meant losing everything. The documents describe this system of shunning, where people who left were totally cut off from everyone they knew, even their own families.
That's awful, like punishing people for wanting to leave.
Yeah, and they would label people who left as fallen souls, like they'd been tricked by Maya or something, and they'd spread rumors and lies about them to scare other people from leaving.
So even if you managed to get out, they were still trying to control you.
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking. This is all so messed up.
It really is. And it's more than just spiritual guidance gone wrong. It's emotional and psychological abuse.
And this is just based on the documents you've seen.
Right.
It's scary to think what else might be going on.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how many people were hurt by this group.
It really does. And it brings us to the story of Cassia, the woman who took her own life. It's a really sad reminder of how dangerous these groups can be, especially for people who are already vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. Her story is incredibly tragic.
Can you tell us a little more about her and what happened?
Sure. So Cassia was a member of the Czaitania mission for years. She was really dedicated, always willing to help out, but she also had social anxiety and might have been autistic.
And how did the group handle that? Did they try to help her?
It doesn't seem like it. Actually, they thought she was lazy and not committed because of her social awkwardness and her struggles with certain tasks.
Oh, wow. So they basically punished her for something that was out of her control.
Yeah, and they would criticize her publicly, which probably made her anxiety even worse.
That's just awful. It's
Yeah.
like they had no compassion at all.
No, it really doesn't seem like they did. And they eventually kicked her out of her position and basically shunned her, all right before she died.
It's like they totally failed her.
Yeah, they did.
This whole thing is just so sad. It really makes you think about how important it is to be careful about which spiritual groups you get involved with.
Absolutely. Not all spiritual groups are like this, of course. There are plenty of good ones out there, but you have to be careful.
So, for anyone listening, what can we do to protect ourselves? How can we make sure we don't end up in a situation like this?
That's the big question, and it's not always easy to answer. But I think the first thing is to just be aware, like know the warning signs.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff, disturbing stuff even.
Yeah, it's been a lot.
But, like, where do we go from here? How can we use this information to keep ourselves and other people safe from these kinds of harmful groups?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's tough. Like, there's no easy answer.
Right.
But I think the first step is just being aware, like we said before, knowing the signs, the red flags, that a group might not be what it seems.
Yeah, totally. Can you give us some specific examples? Like, what should people be looking out for?
Well, we've seen a lot of them in this deep dive, right? Like controlling people's lives, pressuring them for money, isolating them from their friends and family, demonizing people who leave, being secretive. All those things are huge red flags. And it's important to remember these groups can be really good at making themselves look appealing. They use language that makes you feel like they have all the answers, like they can give you the connection and purpose you're looking for.
Yeah, it's not always some creepy guy in a robe, right?
Exactly. They can be very sophisticated, very subtle.
So basically, don't check your brain at the door.
Right. Use your critical thinking skills. Don't be afraid to ask questions, to challenge what they're saying, to get other people's opinions. If something feels wrong, trust that feeling. You always have the right to say no, even if you've already joined.
Yeah, that's so important. What about, like, if you have a friend or a family member who's involved in a group like this? What can you do?
That's hard. Confronting them directly often doesn't work. These groups are really good at making their members feel like anyone who criticizes them is the enemy.
So it's like an us versus them mentality.
Exactly. So the best thing you can do is be patient, be compassionate, stay connected with them, let them know you're there for them no matter what. Maybe you can gently share some information or resources that might help them question what they're being told.
But don't push too hard.
Right, don't push. Ultimately, it's their decision whether to leave or not.
It's tough, wanting to help, but also knowing you can't force them. Are there any organizations or anything that can help people in these situations?
Yeah, definitely. There are a lot of groups dedicated to helping people who've been affected by cults and manipulative groups. One is the International Cultic Studies Association, ICSA. They have a website, a hotline, and they can even connect you with therapists who specialize in cult recovery.
That's good to know. And it's important to remember that not all spiritual groups are bad, right? There are good ones out there, ones that genuinely want to help people.
Absolutely. This isn't about being afraid of all spirituality. It's about being informed, about doing your research before you commit to anything.
Yeah, like look into the group's history, their teachings.
Mm,
Talk to people who are involved or who have left.
exactly. And most importantly, listen to yourself. If your gut is telling you something's not right, it probably isn't.
This whole deep dive has really made me think. It's crazy how these groups can manipulate people, especially when they're using spirituality as a cover.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we all need to be critical thinkers. Don't just accept what you're told, question things, and don't give up your power to anyone, no matter how convincing they seem.
Right, searching for meaning and purpose is a good thing,
Yeah.
but you got to do it with your eyes open.
Well said.
Well, this has been a really intense deep dive. I mean, we've gone through some really dark stuff,
Yeah, we have.
but hopefully, talking about this will help people make good choices about their own spiritual journeys and help those who have been hurt by these groups. Knowledge is power, right?
It really is.
And sometimes it can even set you free.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, thanks for being here. This was a really important conversation.
Thanks for having me. It was my pleasure.